The grand amphitheater of the Helios Bastion Interstellar Strategy Academy was a monument explicitly built to intimidate. Carved directly from the obsidian bedrock of a dead asteroid, its tiered seating spiraled downward like the jaws of a leviathan, focusing all attention on a central platform bathed in harsh, clinical white light. This was the theater of the Legends of War seminar, an elite academic rite of passage where the finest young military minds from 100 different species gathered to present the apex of their martial histories. On paper, it was an exercise in comparative strategic analysis. In practice, it was a bloodless flexing of galactic muscle. The air inside the cavernous hall was purposefully kept frigid, smelling faintly of ozone and polished stone, designed to keep the cadets alert and uncomfortable. For 3 agonizing hours, the presentations had been a relentless, deafening parade of godlike figures and catastrophic violence. A cadet from the Kral Empire, a towering mass of armored scales and predatory muscle, roared the saga of a warlord who had shattered a blockade of 10,000 ships using only the gravitational shear of a dying star. A representative of the luminous Ethelite described a fleet admiral who had conquered a star cluster encompassing 40 distinct inhabited worlds, erasing entire civilizations from the map in a campaign of terrifying elegance. Then came Siren Hall, a cadet of the telepathic Urobi. Her voice echoed directly inside the minds of everyone present as she recounted the chilling tale of a psychic commander who had subjugated a planetary rebellion of 2 billion souls without a single kinetic weapon being fired, rewriting the neurological pathways of an entire species in a matter of minutes. These were the unquestioned standards of greatness at Helios Bastion. To be a legend was to break the universe and reshape it in your own violent image. Then, the holographic projection field shifted to the deep, unassuming blue crest of the United Earth Directorate. Cadet Greer Holloway stood up. She did not possess the towering, heavily armored physique of a Kral or the radiant, blinding aura of an Ethelite. She was human, compact, and perfectly still, wearing the stark, utilitarian black uniform of her species. She walked down the steep obsidian steps to the center platform with deliberate, measured strides. The silence that settled over the amphitheater was not one of respect, but of profound, bored curiosity. Humanity was a newcomer to the cosmic stage, a species whose military record was considered terribly mundane, if not entirely primitive, by galactic standards. Greer stepped into the harsh white light. She did not project a hologram of a burning galaxy, a shattered armada, or a conquered world. She brought up a simple, grainy, 2-dimensional tactical schematic showing a scattering of civilian transport vessels and the swirling, chaotic vortex of a localized gravity storm. "My subject," Greer began, her voice exceptionally steady, cutting through the chill of the massive room, "is Willa Stroud." She was not a grand general. She was not a warlord or a conqueror. She was a Class 4 navigation technician. A faint, rustling murmur rippled through the upper tiers of the amphitheater. A technician, not a commander. The concept was immediately offensive to the sensibilities of the warrior castes present. During the collapse of the Outer Rim colonies, Greer continued, her tone strictly factual, devoid of any theatrical inflection. An evacuation fleet carrying 50,000 civilians was caught in the gravitational rip of a localized spatial anomaly. The automated relay network, their only guiding path out of the crush zone, suffered a catastrophic failure. The fleet was blind, caught in a tidal current that would tear their hulls apart in less than 20 minutes. She manipulated the console, highlighting a tiny, almost invisible blip on the very edge of the storm's perimeter. Willa Stroud was stationed alone at Relay Station 7. When the automated systems burned out, she manually bypassed the safety limiters to establish a physical link. For 9 consecutive hours, she held the signal network open by hand. She routed the targeting lasers through her own primary console, effectively acting as the physical conduit for the massive data stream. The ambient heat in her control room reached 180 degrees. Her protective suit melted directly to her skin. She suffered total neural degradation from the feedback loop. But the signal held. The fleet navigated the storm. 50,000 people survived. Willis Stroud died at her post, alone, 2 hours after the last ship cleared the anomaly. Greer stepped back, letting the grainy, static image of the small relay station hang in the heavy air. For a brief, suspended second, there was total silence. Then, a low, rumbling sound broke the quiet. It was laughter. It started within the Kral delegation, a series of harsh, barking grunts, and quickly spread to the Valor contingent. It was not boisterous or joyful, but rather a dismissive, deeply patronizing chuckle. It was the exact sound of apex predators being told a sentimental story about a brave prey animal. From the front row, Kaelor Drave rose gracefully to his feet. He was a Valor, a species selectively bred for centuries to achieve tactical supremacy. He was tall, striking, with sharp, angular features and eyes, like polished obsidian, that held no warmth. His uniform was heavily adorned with honors he had earned in real combat before he was even 20 years old. "Cadet Holloway," Kaelor said, his voice ringing out, dripping with aristocratic amusement. "I believe you have fundamentally misunderstood the premise of this seminar. We are here to study legends of war. We are here to analyze figures whose strategic brilliance altered the course of history. What you have just described is a beacon keeper." A few more sharp chuckles echoed through the dark stone room, validating his mockery. "It is an admirable, if quaint, trait of your species," Kaelor continued, pacing slowly at the edge of the platform, commanding the room's attention effortlessly. "You conflate mere duty with true greatness. A technician doing her job, even to the point of a painful death, is certainly a tragedy. But it does not win wars. It does not break empires. Holding a door open for fleeing refugees is a footnote in a logistics report. It is not a legend." Greer's expression did not change. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly, a microscopic compression of muscle under her skin, but her eyes remained entirely flat and unreadable. She looked up at Kaelor, absorbing the heavy insult without a single flinch or shift in posture. From across the room, Sirenal leaned forward. The Urobi telepath did not laugh. Her pale, translucent face was entirely serious as she projected her thoughts directly into the open space. Her mental voice, an icy whisper, cutting through the ambient noise. "Kaelor is crude, but his underlying logic is structurally sound. Cadet Holloway. A military legend must be an axis upon which history turns. Saving a single fleeing convoy is a localized act of preservation. It lacks the kinetic impact required to define a species' strategic doctrine. If this isolated act of martyrdom is the pinnacle of human martial achievement, it suggests a profound, perhaps fatal, limitation in your species' capacity for offensive projection." The amphitheater waited for the human to break. They expected anger. They expected a passionate, desperately futile defense of her fallen technician. They expected her to raise her voice, to flush red, and to argue the moral high ground, which was the predictable, tiresome refuge of the weak. Greer did none of those things. She looked at Kaelor. She looked at Sira. Then, she reached out and deactivated the hologram. The projector hummed as it powered down, plunging the center platform back into stark, unforgiving white light. "Thank you for your assessments," Greer said. Her voice was pure ice, betraying absolutely nothing. She turned her back on the Valor prodigy and walked deliberately up the steep obsidian steps toward her seat. She sat down, keeping her spine perfectly straight, resting her hands neatly on her knees. The absolute lack of reaction, the cold, clinical acceptance of their mockery, was sudden and jarring. It immediately robbed Kaelor of his rhetorical victory. Her silence felt less like a retreat and more like she was passively watching children fail a critical test they did not even realize they were taking. It was an infuriatingly calm display of restraint. The lecture master, a multi-limbed synthetic entity hovering near the podium, cleared its vocal emitters and called for the next presenter, eager to move past the awkwardness of the human demonstration. The heavy atmosphere of the room shifted rapidly back to the grand, comfortable tales of planetary conquest. No one looked at the human section anymore, except for one person. In the very last row of the amphitheater, shrouded in the dim, neglected ambient light of the upper tier, sat an older human man. He wore a plain, unadorned gray uniform completely devoid of any medals, rank insignias, or tactical markings. His weathered hands were clasped loosely over the polished handle of a lightweight cane resting between his knees. His face was a landscape of deep, quiet lines, perfectly still, his sharp eyes fixed intensely on Greer. As Greer settled into her seat, letting the sounds of the alien academy wash over her, she allowed her gaze to flick upward toward the shadows, just for a fraction of a second. The man in the gray uniform held her eyes. Slowly, with an almost imperceptible motion of his head, he gave a single, distinct nod. Nobody else saw it. But for Greer, as the fires of an unvoiced anger burned quietly in her chest, it was the only evaluation in the entire room that mattered. The Hall of Honors was a cathedral of light and polished vitriol. Tonight, it hosted the Vanguard Gala, the crown jewel of Veterans Week. The vaulted ceiling, suspended by architectural force fields, simulated the pristine nebula of the Orion Cygnus arm, casting a slow, breathing luminescence over the gathering. Crystalline chandeliers refracted the light into thousands of sharp, colored shards that danced across the dress uniforms of the Academy elite. Every square inch of the Great Hall was dedicated to the physical manifestation of glory. Towering statues of heavy-gravity warlords flanked the main promenade, their weaponized appendages rendered in flawless iridium. Holographic portraits of fleet commanders, their chests weighed down by literal pounds of ceremonial metal, cycled endlessly along the curved walls. Greer navigated the perimeter with a flute of synthesized nectar in her hand, her dark eyes tracking the visual history of the Alliance. It was an overwhelming display of martial dominance. Yet, as she walked the length of the endless commemorative murals, the silence surrounding her own species was deafening. There were sweeping tapestries depicting the Valor conquests, towering monolithic slabs recording the telepathic victories of the Orobi, and kinetic sculptures honoring the Kral shock troopers. Humanity, however, was a ghost in the hall. Greer found exactly one mention, a small, flat bronze plaque near the service doors, noting a logistical supply line secured by Earth forces during a minor border dispute nearly 50 years ago. That was it. In the grand, curated narrative of the stars, humanity was nothing more than a footnote, a junior partner allowed into the room only to carry the water for the true architects of history. The atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to shift as the main doors parted. A unified, reverent hush fell over the hundreds of cadets and junior officers. General Drox Kareth had arrived. He was a living monument, a prime specimen of the Tholaxian heavy infantry. Kareth towered over the crowd, his exoskeleton etched with the deep, jagged thermal scars of 100 orbital drops. He moved with a terrifying grace, the heavy thud of his ceremonial boots instantly commanding the space. Every cadet in the room, Kaylor Drave included, had memorized his campaigns before they were 10 years old. He was the undisputed god of the assault, a commander who had famously broken the siege of the Shattered Moons by dropping his own flagship directly onto the enemy capital. Kareth was immediately swarmed by a constellation of admirals, diplomats, and eager prodigies, all desperate to bask in the gravitational pull of a genuine legend. By stark contrast, the human delegation entered through a secondary archway with zero fanfare. They were exactly 3 people. Leading them was a retired Earth Marshal, looking intensely uncomfortable in his stiff dress uniform, followed closely by a civilian strategic advisor, nervously adjusting his collar. Bringing up the rear was the man in the plain gray suit. He carried no medals. He wore no ceremonial sash. He leaned slightly on his thin, polished cane. His face, an unreadable mask of calm detachment. The master of ceremonies, a floating diplomatic drone, announced the arrivals with an automated, perfectly polite disinterest. When it reached the gray man, the drone simply stated, "And accompanying the directorate delegation, military auditor Elias Rook." An auditor. The word hung in the air, instantly categorizing him in the minds of the warrior elite. He was a man who counted rations, who checked fuel manifests, who argued over the price of hyperdrive coolants. He was the absolute antithesis of everything the Hall of Honor stood for. Standing near the appetizer stations, Kaelor Drev paused his conversation with an ethelite prince to glance at the human trio. His dark, obsidian eyes slid right over the retired marshal, dismissed the civilian, and landed briefly on Rook. Kaelor's lip curled in a microscopic sneer of aristocratic disdain. He took a sip of his drink, turned his back entirely on the human delegation, and resumed his discussion about the physics of plasma bombardments. To Kaelor, an auditor was not even worth the energy required to insult him. As the gala progressed, the social stratification hardened into physical geography. The center of the room was a blazing core of celebrated heroes and their wealthy admirers. The edges of the room were reserved for the administrative staff and the lesser species. Elias Rook had drifted away from his two human companions. He stood entirely alone by the massive, curved observation window that looked out into the absolute black of deep space. He held no drink. He spoke to no one. What struck Greer the most was how thoroughly invisible he was. Brilliant young officers in resplendent armor walked past him, sometimes brushing against his gray sleeve, without breaking their stride or acknowledging his existence. They navigated around him exactly as they would a structural pillar or a decorative plant. He was a piece of unremarkable furniture in a room built for gods. Beside Greer, Cadet Julian Hayes, another human from the orbital academies, was turning a dangerous shade of red. He gripped his glass so tightly, his knuckles were white. "This is a disgrace," Julian muttered, his voice a tight, angry hiss. "They put our delegation next to the kitchen vents, and they are treating that old man like he is the janitor. I am going to go over there and introduce him to the Kral General myself. They need to show some basic diplomatic respect." Julian took a half step forward, his jaw set. Greer moved instantly. Her hand shot out, her fingers clamping down on Julian's wrist with the cold, unyielding pressure of a vice. She did not look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the lone figure of Elias Rook by the window. "Do not move." "Cadet," Greer said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly flat register. "Greer, they are humiliating us," Julian whispered fiercely, struggling against her grip. "We have to say something." "You will do nothing," Greer replied smoothly, her grip tightening until Julian winced. "You do not force a piece onto the board before the board is ready to receive it. Let them look right through him. Let them think what they want. Watch the cadence of the room. Julian, do not interrupt the rhythm." Julian stared at her, deeply unsettled by the total lack of ego in her eyes. He slowly relaxed his arm, stepping back into the shadows beside her, though his face remained a mask of frustrated impotence. Greer released him, her attention never wavering from the glass. The gala stretched into its final hour. The string quartets were playing a slow, mournful victory dirge from the inner colonies. General Drox Kareth was preparing to depart, surrounded by a phalanx of honor guards. He was midway through a booming anecdote about a tactical planetary strike, gesturing broadly with a massive, scarred hand. Then he stopped. The general's booming laughter died in his throat, his heavy, armored shoulders squared. He had happened to glance across the vast expanse of the hall, past the gold statues, past the holographic monuments, and past the crowd of adoring cadets. His gaze had locked onto the observation window. Elias Rook had not moved. He was still leaning slightly on his cane, his back to the room, staring out into the void. Kareth stared at the back of the gray suit. The Tholaxian warlord's eyes, usually burning with aggressive fire, suddenly widened in a complex, heavy mixture of profound shock and something that looked terrifyingly like cold dread. For 10 agonizing seconds, the apex predator of the Alliance military completely froze. He did not speak. He did not blink. He just stared at the military auditor. The silence radiating from the general was so absolute that the immediate circle around him stopped talking, looking around in confusion to see what had commanded his attention. But Kareth broke the spell instantly. He turned away, his face hardening into an unreadable slab of muscle, and marched swiftly toward the exit without finishing his story, his entourage scrambling to keep up. From her vantage point in the shadows, Greer took a slow, deliberate breath. The air in the opulent hall suddenly felt thin. The glittering statues and holographic medals seemed for just a fraction of a second like flimsy, hollow props upon a very fragile stage. Beneath the polished marble and the blinding light of the gala, a vast, invisible chasm had just opened up, revealing a terrifying distance between the history everyone was celebrating and the truth standing quietly by the glass. She looked back at Elias Rook. The auditor had not turned around. He simply continued to watch the stars, leaning on his cane, utterly undisturbed by the sudden departure of a god. The Urobi do not sleep as humans do. They enter a state of shallow cognitive rest, allowing the ambient psychic noise of their surroundings to wash over them like a gentle tide. At Helios Bastion, this tide was usually a chaotic, vibrant storm of alien egos, anxieties, and dreams of conquest. Tonight, however, Sirenal found herself wide awake, pacing the cold metallic floor of her thermal quarters. It was the silence that kept her from resting. Earlier, during the reception in the Great Hall, Sira had instinctively cast her telepathic awareness across the room, feeling the bright, burning stars of the celebrated generals and the anxious, flickering candles of the junior officers. But when her mind brushed against the human designated as Elias Rook, she hit something entirely impossible. It was not a psychic shield. Shields hummed with the energy required to maintain them. They felt like static, a forced, vibrating barrier against intrusion. Rook had no barrier. His mind was simply a void. It was a perfectly constructed, infinitely deep architecture of absolute quiet. It felt intentional. It felt exactly like walking into a massive, underground vault where the air had been violently vacuumed out, leaving only the terrifying, crushing weight of nothingness. Driven by a creeping dread she could not rationally define, Sira left her quarters and drifted down the darkened, skeletal corridors to the Academy Library Nexus. The vast, cylindrical data core was deserted, illuminated only by the soft blue glow of standby terminals. She sat at a secluded console, interfaced her biometric signature, and brought up the public military registry of the United Earth Directorate. She searched for Elias Rook. The file that materialized on the holographic display was profoundly insulting in its brevity. For a man who carried the physical weight and the unreadable aura of a veteran who had seen the raw edge of the universe, his record read like that of a mid-level supply clerk who had never left orbital logistics. There were exactly 24 years of active service listed, yet, under the commendations tab, there were only 3 entries. They were trivial, bureaucratic notes praising his efficiency in ration distribution and cargo manifest management. But the mundane commendations were not what disturbed the telepath. It was the blank spaces. Between the unremarkable entries were vast, yawning gaps of time, Entire chunks of years simply did not exist. When she attempted to cross-reference his deployment locations, the terminal returned walls of solid black text. Heavily redacted, almost 90% of his active timeline was permanently sealed behind highest-tier administrative locks. Why would the Alliance military go to such extreme lengths to scrub the record of a simple auditor? What logistical nightmare could possibly warrant a total information blackout across multiple systems? Sira terminated the connection, the glow of the screen fading from her pale face. The quiet mystery of the human was a splinter in her mind. She needed an anchor point. She found Greer Holloway in the tertiary observation lounge. The human cadet was sitting alone in the dim light, nursing a mug of synthetic tea, watching the distant, slow rotation of a gas giant through the viewport. Greer looked entirely at peace with the heavy darkness of the room. Sira approached without making a sound, though Greer did not flinch when the telepath finally spoke. "His mind is missing," Sira said flatly, taking the seat opposite the human. "Elias Rook. There is a structural silence inside his head that violates every known biological law of cognition. I checked his public file. It is practically empty. A person with an aura that heavy does not leave a footprint that light. Why does your species hide him?" Greer took a slow sip of her tea. She did not look surprised by the intrusion or the directness of the question. She set the mug down on the glass table and looked at Sira, evaluating the Arobi cadet with cold, intensely analytical eyes. "You are looking at the public registry," Greer said softly. Her voice carried the same measured, chilling neutrality as it had during her presentation in the amphitheater. "I am looking at a fabricated ghost," Sira countered, her pale eyes narrowing in frustration. "Do not give me the standard diplomatic evasion, Greer. I felt what General Kareth felt today." The room shifted. "That old man is not a clerk." Greer remained silent for a long, agonizing minute. She seemed to be weighing the tactical cost of sharing classified information against the inevitability of Sira's relentless curiosity. Finally, Greer reached into the lining of her uniform pocket and retrieved a small, encrypted data sliver. She slotted it into the table's interface and keyed in a complex, multi-tiered authorization sequence. A localized, low-light projection flared to life between them. "I cannot show you his actual rank," Greer said, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can show you fragments of what he did before the records were buried." A document materialized. It was not a glorious saga or a sweeping historical narrative designed to inspire recruits. It was an after-action report, stripped of all adjectives, written in the sterile, bone-dry language of a coroner's autopsy. Sira read the scrolling text. It detailed an engagement at a deep space asteroid relay station. Elias Rook, then a non-commissioned officer, was stationed there with exactly 18 other humans. According to the perimeter sensors, they were suddenly besieged by a rogue faction force, outnumbering them by a ratio of 80-1. There were no tales of heroic charges. There was no mention of honorable duels or inspiring speeches broadcast on open channels. The report simply listed the sequential, systematic dismantling of the station's own infrastructure. Under Rook's direct command, the 19 humans had removed the primary pressure walls. They had reprogrammed the automated mining drones to act as kinetic proximity mines. They had entirely reversed the atmospheric filtration systems, flooding the main boarding corridors with lethal, unbreathable coolant gas. They did not fight to hold the station in any traditional sense. They turned the station itself into a pressurized slaughterhouse. The engagement lasted for 4 uninterrupted days. When the Alliance reinforcement fleet finally arrived, they found the enemy force completely annihilated. The 19 humans were sitting in the zero-gravity core, waiting in their environmental suits, having cannibalized their own sanctuary to survive. Sira felt a cold shiver trace its way down her spine. The absolute ruthlessness of it was staggering. It was not war as the Valor or the Kral understood it. It was brutal, mathematical survival. Greer swiped her hand across the interface, bringing up a second file. This one was categorized under the innocuous heading of a navigational incident. Sirah scanned the dense tactical data. A massive logistical convoy, carrying enough refined plasma and synthetic protein to supply 3 entire battlefronts, had been caught in a severe, localized gravity storm. The summary revealed the terrifying stakes. If that convoy had been lost, 3 distinct planetary sieges would have collapsed simultaneously. Millions of Alliance soldiers would have starved or run out of ammunition within exactly 2 weeks. The collapse of the defensive line was mathematically certain. The file noted that Elias Rook had charted and executed a blind micro-jump directly through the violent eye of the gravity shear, pulling the entire massive convoy out of the crush zone using an experimental, highly unstable tethering maneuver. It was an act of supreme, reality-bending navigational genius. It had literally saved the entire sector war effort from a catastrophic collapse. Yet, at the bottom of the report, the commendation section was entirely blank. The official classification remained a minor traffic anomaly. The man had saved 3 armies from annihilation, and history had filed his miracle away as a routine paperwork error. Why? Sirah breathed, genuinely horrified by the systematic erasure of such profound achievement. This is a triumph. The Etholite would have built a monument of pure light to him on every world in the core systems. Why would you deliberately bury the people who keep you alive? Look at the red text at the absolute bottom of the directory, Greer instructed, her face impassive. Sirah shifted her focus. At the very edge of the encrypted interface, blinking in a slow, ominous pulse, was a localized system warning. Warning: public disclosure of full theater data may reactivate mimetic hazard. Sirah stared at the glowing words. A mimetic hazard. The concept was highly theoretical, a terrifying subject discussed only in the highest, most abstract echelons of Urobi psychic theory. A weaponized thought, a structural contagion that spread not through the air or through blood, but through information, through history, through the very act of knowing and remembering. What does this mean? Sirah asked, her voice trembling slightly, the chill in the room suddenly feeling much deeper. What kind of enemy responds to a memory? Greer reached out and smoothly extracted the data sliver from the console. The projection vanished instantly, plunging them back into the dim, shadowy light of the observation lounge. The human cadet looked out at the silent stars, her expression hardening into something ancient and incredibly weary. The universe is full of predators, Sirah, Greer said, her tone completely devoid of any warmth or comfort. Most of them hunt for territory, or resources, or pride. But not all of them. Greer stood up, adjusting the collar of her black uniform with precise, mechanical movements. She looked down at the telepath, her dark eyes locking onto Sirah's pale ones with a terrifying intensity. There are some wars that do not end when the enemy is defeated, Greer said, the absolute certainty in her voice echoing in the quiet room. They just sleep until they are remembered correctly. The tactical simulation theater, known as the Crucible, was a spherical chamber of brushed steel and hard light projectors. Today, the central holosphere was rendering the topographic nightmare of the Ashen Fold. It was a legendary Alliance disaster, a deeply studied anomaly where a superior coalition force had evaporated in less than 48 hours. The objective for the elite cadet cadre was simple: survive longer than the historical commanders did. Kaelor Drev stood at the primary command pedestal, his hands flying across the haptic interface. He had assembled a flawless coalition command structure. He placed the heavy Valor dreadnoughts in a vanguard formation, establishing a rigid, glorious center of gravity. He positioned the telepathic Urobi seers directly adjacent to the flagship to provide precognitive shielding for the high generals. He arrayed the Kral shock infantry in a classic crescent defense, designed to draw the enemy into a brutal, honorable melee. Every textbook in the academy dictated this was the pinnacle of martial deployment. It centralized authority, protected the irreplaceable strategic minds, and presented an unbreakable wall of champions to the opposing force. The simulation commenced. The enemy, represented by a swarming, amorphous red mass on the display, did not engage the Kral vanguard. It did not attempt to flank the heavy dreadnoughts. Instead, it moved with a horrifying liquid fluidity, bypassing the front lines entirely. The red markers cascaded through the gaps in the crescent defense, ignoring high-value logistical targets, and surged directly toward the command nexus. "Shift the vanguard," Kalor barked, his voice tight. "Bring the dreadnoughts around to cover the command peak. Form a Praetorian wall." The cadets scrambled to execute the maneuver, but the simulation responded with brutal mathematical indifference. The moment the dreadnoughts turned, exposing their lateral thruster banks, the red swarm fractured. A micro-fraction of the enemy engaged the turning ships, while the vast majority suddenly coalesced into a single, hyper-dense spearhead. It struck the Orobi telepathic shield, shattering it in exactly 7 seconds. It then pierced the flagship's hull. The command pedestal flashed a violent, blinding crimson. Total structural failure. The supreme commanders were dead. Without the generals to issue orders, the rigid chain of command dissolved. The Krail infantry, waiting for the signal to charge, were surrounded and picked apart. The dreadnoughts, suddenly blind without their central coordinator, fired wildly into the void before being systematically dismantled. The simulation ended. The elapsed time read 12 minutes and 40 seconds. They had performed significantly worse than the historical failure. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the crucible. Kalor stared at the red projection. His jaw clenched so tightly, the muscles trembled. This was mathematically impossible. His deployment was structurally perfect. From the raised observation decks, the senior alien instructors began their familiar, comforting autopsies of the failure. A Tholaxian tactician pointed out a slight delay in the vanguard's rotation. An Ethelite strategist argued that the Orobi seers should have been positioned further back to extend the warning perimeter. They were searching for conventional mistakes: a misplaced turret, a slow supply line, a minor lapse in fire discipline. Nobody was asking the right question. Nobody could explain the sheer, predatory speed of the collapse. "You are assuming the enemy wanted to win territory," a voice said. The words were spoken at a conversational volume, yet they cut through the frantic chatter of the instructors with the clean precision of a surgical blade. Every head in the crucible turned toward the upper gallery. Elias Rook stood near the exit, his hands resting on his cane. He did not raise his voice, nor did he look at the instructors. His eyes were fixed entirely on the smoldering red ruins of Kalor's holographic fleet. "In that battle," Rook continued, his tone entirely devoid of lecture or condescension, "what it wanted was to learn your heroic structure." The alien instructors bristled at the interruption from a human auditor, but Kalor did not look away. The Valor prodigy felt a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline. "Explain yourself, human," Kalor demanded, his voice echoing in the silent room. Rook descended the first few steps of the gallery, his movement slow and deliberate. "You built a pyramid, Cadet Drev. You put your most valuable assets, your legends, your supreme commanders, at the absolute apex. You designed your entire force to protect that peak. You projected your command structure outward like a beacon." Rook pointed his cane at the hovering red mass on the display. "That enemy did not care about your supply lines. It did not care about the ground you held. It calculated the exact center of your pride. Once it identified the apex of your command, it threw everything it had at that single point. It did not need to destroy your army. It only needed to break the nervous system that depended entirely on that symbol. Once the head was severed, the body died of panic." The crucible was utterly silent. The tactical brilliance of the observation was paralyzing. Rook had just invalidated centuries of galactic military doctrine with a single, devastating insight. The enemy had weaponized their worship of heroes. "Reset the simulation," Rook ordered. The command was spoken softly, but it carried an undeniable, gravitational weight. The instructors hesitated, but Kaylor waved his hand over the console. The board wiped clean, resetting to the initial deployment phase. "We do not have the firepower to withstand a direct spearhead without the dreadnoughts at the center," Kaylor stated, challenging the old man. "Then remove the center," Rook replied. He walked down to the tactical floor, standing directly beside the Valor. "Dismantle the pyramid. Disperse your heavy ships to the extreme edges of the grid. Break down the Supreme Command into 50 localized nodes. Give tactical autonomy to the people who actually touch the machinery." Kaylor stared at him as if he had suggested they surrender. "You want me to hand fleet coordination to mechanics and signalmen?" "I want you to make the enemy search for a head that does not exist," Rook corrected. "When the vanguard collapses, do not pull back to protect a general. Have your combat engineers turn the debris field into a proximity minefield. Have your medical frigates broadcast false command signatures to draw fire. Turn every single line of retreat into the backbone of a counterattack. Make your survival decentralized." It went against every instinct bred into Kaylor's DNA. It felt messy, undignified, and entirely lacking in glory. It was the tactics of a cornered animal, not a conquering empire. But the memory of his 12-minute defeat still burned bitterly in his mind. With a tight, reluctant nod, Kaylor began reorganizing the board. He shattered his beautiful, symmetrical formations. He scattered the command codes across the fleet, burying them in the consoles of junior lieutenants, maintenance chiefs, and logistics coordinators. The map looked chaotic, a sprawling, disorganized mess of isolated units. He initiated the simulation. The amorphous red mass surged forward, instantly seeking the heaviest concentration of command signals. But there was no center. The enemy force hesitated, its algorithm struggling to identify a primary target. It lunged at a cluster of false signatures, broadcast by a medical ship, only to be caught in a crossfire coordinated by a mechanic operating a repurposed mining laser. The battle was ugly. It was a grinding, punishing attrition. There were no grand cavalry charges or brilliant, sweeping flanks. It was a desperate, bleeding retreat. Whenever the enemy managed to isolate and destroy a localized command node, another one simply flared to life in the engineering bay of a different vessel. The chain of command was not a rigid pillar. It was a sprawling, subterranean root system. 2 hours passed, then 3 hours. The cadet forces were taking horrific casualties, but they were not breaking. The decentralized structure absorbed the damage, fluidly reassigning roles as ships went dark. They traded space for time, dragging the enemy through a gauntlet of booby-trapped wreckage and overlapping, erratic firing arcs. When the simulation timer finally reached the extraction window, 70% of the cadet force had been obliterated. But the core personnel, the essential surviving elements of the fleet, successfully breached the hyperlane perimeter and escaped. The simulation concluded. The board flashed a muted, bruised blue. Victory by survival. The crucible erupted into frantic, whispered debates. The alien instructor stared at the board in profound disbelief, trying to reconcile the chaotic, humiliating tactics with the undeniable fact of survival. Kaylor Drev did not speak. He stood frozen at the command pedestal, his hands resting on the cool surface of the console. He was breathing heavily, his mind struggling to process the structural paradigm shift he had just experienced. He had won by erasing his own importance from the battlefield. Slowly, Kaylor turned his head. Elias Rook was already walking away, ascending the steps toward the exit. He leaned slightly on his cane, a small, fragile figure draped in plain gray cloth. Kaylor watched the human disappear into the shadows of the corridor. For the first time in his life, The Valor warrior did not see a logistics clerk. He saw something terrifyingly dense, something that possessed an understanding of violence so profound and dark that it could not be quantified by medals or statues. Kalor's formidable pride still choked his throat, preventing him from admitting it aloud. But the fracture in his worldview was now permanently set. The old man knew exactly how to dismantle gods. Sira pushed her telepathic consciousness into the darkest, most heavily encrypted corners of the Helios Bastion archival network. It had taken her exactly 48 hours of relentless, quiet searching since the tactical simulation to find a thread worth pulling. The redactions surrounding human military history were not simply defensive walls. They were psychological labyrinths designed to exhaust and confuse the seeker. But she eventually found fragments. Burned edges of digital paper hidden beneath layers of mundane supply requisitions. They all pointed to a single, recurring cryptographic tag that possessed no official translation: the Lantern Doctrine. She tracked down Greer in the atmospheric processing atrium, a damp, heavily oxygenated space filled with towering synthetic fern structures and the constant hum of water filtration. Kalor Drave was already there, pacing the metal-grated floor like a caged predator. The Valor prodigy was still violently grappling with his shattered worldview from the crucible simulation, demanding answers from the human cadet who remained infuriatingly calm. Sira stepped out of the shadows and projected the fragmented files directly onto the misty glass of the botanical enclosure. The glowing text illuminated their faces in a pale, ghostly light. "It is not a battlefield tactic," Sira said, her mental voice dropping the ambient temperature of the room, broadcasting her chilling discovery to both of them. "It is an entire philosophy of systematic erasure. The Lantern Doctrine. Your species intentionally shatters its own monuments. You take a victory that requires the sacrifice of 10,000 soldiers, and you officially attribute it to a localized weather event, a structural collapse, or a simple clerical error. Why would a species do this?" Greer looked at the scrolling, fragmented text on the glass. She took a slow breath, the heavy, moist air filling her lungs. "Because we do not just worship the person who plants the flag on the summit," Greer explained, her voice heavy with an inherited, generational exhaustion. "We revere the people who hold the light so others can find their way out of the dark. The engineers who keep the engines from melting down. The medics who refuse to leave the bleeding. A lantern does not win the war. It simply refuses to let you die in the shadows. With certain enemies, if you put your hero on a pedestal, you just give the dark a target to shoot at. So, we break the glory into 1,000 invisible pieces. We hide the hero so the enemy cannot extinguish the light." Kalor stopped pacing, his aristocratic face contorted into a mask of deep, visceral revulsion. The very concept assaulted his genetic programming. "That is the mindset of a frightened, cornered prey animal." Kalor spat, his voice echoing sharply off the humid glass walls. "To hide your glory is to insult the blood spilled to achieve it. It looks like cowardice. It looks like you are deeply ashamed of your own strength. If you possess greatness, you wield it like a burning hammer for the galaxy to see. You do not bury it in the dirt out of fear." As Kalor spoke those words of arrogant certainty, deep beneath their feet, something shifted. Almost 3 miles down into the crushing obsidian bedrock of the asteroid, an acoustic dampening seal that had held for decades finally fractured. In the central telemetry spire of the Academy, a junior data archivist was running a routine diagnostic sweep when his console screamed. A terminal that had been completely dead for over 80 years suddenly flared with a sickly, pale yellow luminescence. It was an ancient, corrupted distress frequency, a localized pulse pushing upward from the lowest, permanently sealed catacombs beneath the Hall of Honors. The data stream was incredibly dense, composed of an algorithmic language the Academy computers could barely translate. The automated security protocols instantly routed the anomaly to the encrypted earpieces of the senior administrative staff and the highest-ranking distinguished guests. Elias Rook was standing in the grand concourse, quietly observing a massive marble water feature, when the high-pitched, atonal tone pierced his right ear. For the very first time since he had set foot on the station, the terrifyingly calm, impenetrable facade of the gray man completely shattered. The color violently drained from his weathered face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His knuckles turned bone white as his grip tightened on his wooden cane until the polished surface audibly cracked. He stopped breathing. Half a sector away in the opulent, diplomatic lounge, General Drox Kareth was in the middle of a booming, theatrical sentence about his famous orbital drop. The massive Thalaxian warlord stopped dead. His heavy jaw hung open slightly. He did not finish the word. He just stared blankly at the nearest bulkhead, his eyes wide with a sudden, suffocating terror that paralyzed his massive frame. Within exactly 4 minutes, the Academy administration broadcast a soothing, perfectly modulated synthetic voice over the public address system. The voice declared a minor, scheduled recalibration in the subterranean ceremonial lighting network, assuring all personnel that automated maintenance drones were already resolving the minor visual glitch. Greer, walking briskly back to the human sector, watched a group of senior combat instructors rush past her in the corridor. They were moving far too fast for a maintenance issue. Their posture was rigid, their hands unconsciously hovering near their sidearms. Greer possessed an acute ability to read body language, and she recognized the cold, sharp scent of genuine panic. The administration was lying to the entire station. They were absolutely terrified. At exactly 2 hours past midnight, the reinforced door to the human cadet barracks slid open with a soft hiss. Elias Rook stepped into the deep shadows of the sleeping quarters. He did not activate the luminescent strips. He moved silently between the bunks, like a ghost, tapping the metal frames to wake the cadets without making a sound. Greer sat up instantly, her combat instincts immediately taking over. "Set your communication devices to manual receive only," Rook whispered into the darkness. His voice was tight, ragged, and completely stripped of its usual quiet authority. It was the voice of a man standing on the edge of a mass grave. "Do not fall into a deep sleep. Keep your boots by your side. Keep your pulse rifles loaded and under your blankets. If the general emergency alarm sounds tonight, you will not go to the designated muster stations. You will stay entirely off the main grid. You will hide." "Sir, what is happening?" Cadet Julian asked, his voice shaking violently as he fumbled in the dark for his boots. "An old mistake is waking up," Rook replied softly, his eyes locked onto the metal floor panels. "And it is very hungry." Far above them, the Hall of Honors sat in pristine, heavily guarded silence. Hundreds of towering statues and glowing holographic portraits of the greatest heroes the galaxy had ever known stood in glorious, arrogant perfection. They were beautiful monuments to unmatched violence, brilliant tactical minds, and strategic supremacy. They represented the unshakable pride of 100 different alien empires. But deep beneath those polished marble floors, buried under thousands of tons of dead rock and forgotten data files, something ancient was pulsing in the dark. It was reaching its invisible, digital tendrils into the architecture of the station, feeling the heavy vibrations of all that celebrated concentrated glory above. The silence was breaking. The entity was beginning to remember the way back to the surface. The morning light filtering through the high atmospheric domes of the grand auditorium felt distinctly brittle. The entire academy, including the senior staff and the visiting dignitaries, had gathered for the Open Strategic Forum. It was meant to be a theoretical exchange, a civilized debate over the kinetic applications of force. Instead, the air was thick with unvoiced tension from the unexplained alarms of the previous night. Kalor Drev sat in the front tier, his posture rigid. The Valor prodigy had spent the dark hours staring at the ceiling, his mind caught in a brutal loop between his inherited aristocratic pride and the undeniable, humiliating success of the chaotic tactic forced upon him in the crucible simulation. He needed to resolve the cognitive dissonance. He needed to expose the flaw in the human method. When the floor opened for interspecies critique, Kalor stood immediately. He did not look at the instructors. He turned his imposing frame directly toward the small cluster of human cadets. "We have spent the last cycle discussing the supposed hidden depths of human military philosophy," Kalor began, his voice projecting flawlessly across the vast circular room. "We are told that your species operates in the shadows by choice. We are expected to believe that your historical records are heavily redacted, not out of embarrassment, but out of some profound, incomprehensible strategy of humility." Kalor began to pace the lower deck, his obsidian eyes locking onto Greer Holloway. "But strategy requires tangible results. A blank page is just a blank page. I propose a much simpler, far more logical hypothesis," Kalor declared, his tone sharpening into a weapon. "Is it not infinitely more probable that humanity hides its archival data because there is simply nothing of substance to show? That this entire narrative of the hidden hero is merely a psychological defense mechanism designed to mask a fundamental lack of martial capability? You cannot hide a victory that never existed." The auditorium fell deathly silent. It was a direct, brutal accusation of cowardice and institutional fraud. Every alien gaze in the room pivoted to Greer. They expected the human cadet to flush with anger, to stand and furiously defend the honor of her species. Greer remained perfectly still. She merely blinked, her expression a masterclass in absolute apathy. She was not the one who was going to answer. From the highest, darkest tier of the seating arrangement, a voice drifted down. It was not loud, nor was it amplified by the acoustic field, but the sheer, chilling flatness of the tone commanded instant obedience from the echoing room. "You are demanding a metric of capability," Elias Rook said. The old auditor stood up, resting both hands on the polished handle of his wooden cane. The gray fabric of his civilian suit absorbed the light, making him look like a phantom against the obsidian walls. "Very well," Rook continued, his voice steady, devoid of any defensive anger or pride. "Let us discuss the night glass corridor." A ripple of genuine confusion spread among the cadets. The night glass corridor was a geographical location, a notoriously volatile spatial bottleneck. It was not a battle. But in the VIP section, several older alien officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. 40 years ago, Rook spoke into the hushed amphitheater. 3 distinct Alliance fleets were retreating from the outer dark. They were battered, bleeding, and heavily pursued by an entity that possessed processing capabilities far beyond our own. The predictive algorithms gave the 3 fleets a survival probability of 0. Absolute annihilation was guaranteed the moment they entered the bottleneck of the night glass corridor. The enemy was hunting the command frequencies. It was a predator that fed on tactical hierarchy. It tracked the heavy encryption of admirals and generals, calculating their defensive layers and cracking them open like brittle shells. Rook descended 1 step. The entire room watched him. The standard doctrine of every species in this room would dictate that the command structure must be reinforced, that the admirals must be shielded at all costs. We knew that doing so would simply provide a brighter beacon for the slaughter. Rook paused, letting the cold reality of the situation settle over the brilliant, arrogant minds below him. So, the human contingent deployed at the rearguard did the opposite. We intentionally shattered the chain of command. We took the primary fleet coordination codes, the master encryption keys, and the tactical override protocols, and we stripped them from the high command. We distributed them to the absolute bottom of the roster. Kalor frowned, his tactical mind trying to process the sheer chaos of the statement. "To the junior lieutenants." "No," Rook corrected softly. To the people who were completely invisible to a predator hunting for glory, we gave the firing protocols to the thermal engineers, maintaining the reactor coolant. We gave the navigational overrides to the field chefs in the mess halls. We handed the atmospheric containment keys to the mechanics, fixing the airlocks. We took the triage orderlies, the signal technicians, and the cargo loaders, and we made them the supreme commanders of the rearguard. The cadets stared in open disbelief. The concept was not just unconventional, it was offensive. To hand the fate of 3 fleets to a cook and a mechanic was an insult to the very concept of military science. "The enemy struck the bottleneck," Rook said, his eyes unfocused, looking at a memory playing out in the empty air. "It surged forward, its logic engines burning hot, searching for the brilliant, centralized mind coordinating the defense. It searched for the grand strategy. It searched for the hero." Rook descended another step. It found nothing. It found a chaotic, mathematically impossible nightmare. It found a defense grid managed by a mechanic who fired plasma batteries, based on the rhythm of a failing ventilation shaft. It encountered shield rotations coordinated by a triage nurse, who prioritized armor plating based on the flow of casualties in the medical bay. The enemy's predictive algorithms collapsed. You cannot outthink a command structure that does not possess a center. You cannot predict the strategy of 50 desperate, uncoordinated people who are simply refusing to die. The room was paralyzed. The sheer, horrific ingenuity of the tactic was undeniable. Those 50 scattered personnel held the night glass corridor for 48 consecutive hours, Rook stated, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. They fought in the dark, without orders, without coordination, without any hope of reinforcement. They bled the enemy dry with sheer, unpredictable stubbornness. They held the door open long enough for all 3 Alliance fleets to safely transit the bottleneck. Rook looked directly at Kaylor. If you search the archives for that engagement, Cadet Drave, you will not find a monument. You will not find a saga of unparalleled bravery. You will find a single line in a forgotten ledger, classified strictly as a minor logistical reorganization. Kaylor opened his mouth to speak, to offer some counter-argument, some desperate defense of classical warfare. But the words died in his throat. A sound interrupted him. It was the heavy, scraping noise of metal against stone. In the VIP gallery, General Drox Kareth had stood up. The massive Tholaxian warlord, a being who demanded deference from planetary governors, pushed past his honor guard and walked to the edge of the balcony. The entire Academy watched as the living god of war looked down at the old human auditor in the plain gray suit. Kareth did not speak a word. He raised his massive, scarred right fist and slammed it against his armored chestplate, directly over his primary and secondary hearts. The sound was like a thunderclap. He then bowed his heavy, horned head. It was the absolute highest honor a Tholaxian could offer. It was a salute reserved strictly for a warrior of equal or greater stature. It was a gesture of absolute submission to a superior legend. When Kareth finally raised his head, his deep, rumbling voice carried across the silent hall. "I was a junior captain in the 2nd Fleet that day," Kareth said, his voice stripped of its usual booming theatrics, leaving only a raw, haunting sincerity. "We were blind and burning. We thought we were entering a graveyard. We survived because of the broken wall you built in the dark." The shock that hit the auditorium was physical. It was as if the gravity plating had suddenly reversed. The greatest living hero of the Alliance had just publicly confessed that his existence was owed to a human tactic designed to erase glory. Kaylor's arrogant hypothesis was completely, irreversibly pulverized. The silence was absolute. Elias Rook did not smile. He did not look vindicated. He looked incredibly tired. He acknowledged the massive alien general with a barely perceptible nod of his head. Then, Rook turned slightly, casting his gaze over the stunned cadets, leaving them with a statement that instantly dropped the temperature in the room to freezing. You believe that the night glass corridor was a tragedy of erasure, Rook said quietly. But you do not understand. We did not hide those 50 people because we were ashamed. We hid them because we knew the enemy was still out there, and we refused to give it a map to the people who beat it. Rook gripped his cane. And Cadet Drev, Rook added, his eyes completely hollow. That was not the worst thing we have ever faced. The observation deck of Helios Bastion hung over the cosmic void, like a glass balcony at the edge of the universe. It was a place usually reserved for quiet reflection, far removed from the bustling tactical simulators and the echoing lecture halls. Elias Rook stood near the reinforced transparent aluminum, gazing out at the slow rotation of distant star clusters. He leaned heavily on his wooden cane, the gray fabric of his suit blending seamlessly into the muted lighting of the deck. Footsteps approached from the corridor. They were heavy, measured, and distinctively Valor. Kaelor Drev stepped onto the deck. The young prodigy did not carry his usual aura of aristocratic disdain. His shoulders lacked their aggressive set, and his obsidian eyes held a strange, unfamiliar weight. For the very first time since his arrival at the Academy, Kaelor was not seeking a platform to assert his superiority. He was seeking an answer. You do not possess a biological advantage, Kaelor said, his voice quiet, lacking its usual theatrical resonance. I have studied the physiological metrics of your species. You break easily. You require constant sustenance. Your nervous systems are highly susceptible to shock. Yet, you construct military doctrines entirely dependent on individuals absorbing catastrophic pressure. How does a fragile species endure that? Rook did not turn away from the stars. We are deeply fragile, Cadet Drev. We feel terror just as acutely as any Tholaxian or Krell. We panic. We make horrific, cascading errors under fire. We are not immune to fear. The old man shifted his weight slightly on his cane. The distinction does not lie in an absence of fear. It lies in our biological response to absolute desperation. When a human is pushed into a corner, when every logical metric dictates that survival is impossible and death is certain, our psychology fractures in a very specific way. We do not surrender to the math. We become profoundly, irrationally stubborn. Kaelor stepped closer, standing beside the auditor. He looked out at the same expansive space. To the Valor, a hero is the tallest mountain peak. They are the fixed point of navigation. They stand above the clouds, clad in armor, drawing the eye of every soldier below. They inspire by being untouchable. And when the mountain crumbles, the army loses its sky, Rook replied softly. For us, a hero is rarely a monument. A hero is the rusted iron link in a very long chain. They do not shine. They do not draw attention. Their only purpose is to bear the agonizing strain of the load and refuse to snap, so the links on either side can hold. They are the mechanic bleeding out in a sealed room while holding a manual override valve open. They are the communications officer burning their own retinas to keep a targeting laser locked. They are invisible until the exact moment they are required to break themselves to keep others whole. A third presence manifested in the dim light. Sirenal drifted from the shadows of the entrance, her pale, translucent features glowing faintly. She had followed Kaelor, drawn by the profound shift in the Valor's emotional signature. That explains your survival, Sira said, her mental projection crisp and cold in their minds. But it does not explain your silence. I read the warning attached to the encrypted files. A mimetic hazard. You told me there are enemies that sleep until they are remembered correctly. I need to understand the mechanism of that hunt. Rook finally turned his back to the viewport. He looked at the telepath, his weathered face etched with deep, ancient sorrow. Most predators in this universe hunt biological signatures, thermal emissions, or electromagnetic frequencies, Rook explained, his voice low and raspy. But as civilizations evolve, So do the things that feed on them. There are entities born from the absolute darkest corners of the void that do not consume flesh or metal. They consume conceptual structures. They track the density of belief. Kalor frowned, trying to grasp the abstract horror. They track belief. They hunt glory. Rook confirmed. They trace the pathways of your reputation. They feel the weight of your symbols, your honor rituals, your statues, and your models of worship. When a billion minds focus their reverence on a single champion, it creates a massive, blinding beacon in the dark. It is a dinner bell. We learned early in our expansion that parading our greatest warriors merely summoned the things that feed on greatness. Rook raised his cane and pointed toward the core of the academy, directly toward the opulent, sprawling chamber they had occupied the previous evening. You look at the Hall of Honors and you see a glorious tribute to the apex of martial achievement, Rook said. The temperature on the observation deck seemed to plummet with his next words. But you must understand, a room full of hero portraits, in some wars, is not a memorial. It is a gateway. The silence that followed was absolute. Kalor felt a cold dread wash over his skin. A primal, inherited instinct recognizing a lethal threat he had never been taught to fear. He finally understood the human methodology. The United Earth Directorate did not hide its history out of shame or a lack of capability. They were hiding a massive, bleeding strategic wound that the rest of the arrogant, monument-building galaxy was entirely too immature to comprehend. Humanity was operating under blackout conditions, while the rest of the Alliance was shooting fireworks into a pitch-black forest. Before Kalor could articulate this terrifying realization, the deck beneath their boots violently lurched. It was not the mechanical shudder of a structural failing or the kinetic impact of a localized asteroid strike. It was a massive, concussive wave of pure, silent energy that rolled through the very architecture of Helios Bastion. The artificial gravity plating groaned, causing Kalor to stumble forward. All around the observation deck, the sleek, transparent tactical displays and navigational screens flickered wildly. The standard crisp blue interfaces vanished, replaced instantly by a swirling, chaotic storm of hyperdense, alien data streams. The screens did not just display an error. They looked sick. The visual static possessed a sickly, yellow hue, twisting into geometric patterns that hurt the eyes to look at. It felt exactly like watching an organic mind being aggressively overwritten by a foreign, hostile intelligence. Syrah gasped, clutching the sides of her head. Her telepathic aura flared violently, turning a bright, panicked crimson. She dropped to her knees, overwhelmed by a sudden, deafening psychic scream that was echoing not in her ears, but directly against the walls of her consciousness. The Academy network was not just being hacked, it was being possessed. Then, the klaxons began to scream. The primary emergency alarms of Helios Bastion, designed to cut through any ambient noise with a terrifying, rhythmic wail, triggered simultaneously across all 90 sectors of the station. The soothing, pale light of the observation deck snapped off, instantly replaced by the harsh, strobing red glare of absolute crisis mode. The quiet, philosophical debate was dead. The agonizing tension that had been building since the human presentation had finally snapped, plunging the Academy into immediate, chaotic darkness. The entity below the marble floors had finished remembering. The door was open. The Hall of Honors did not detonate. It simply inverted. Down in the deepest ceremonial vaults, the final acoustic seals gave way, releasing a catastrophic pressure that possessed absolutely zero physical mass. What surged upward through the data conduits and ventilation shafts of Helios Bastion was not a biological swarm or a kinetic weapon. It was the mnemonic tide. It was an ancient, starving conceptual architecture, a living paradox that fed entirely on the rigid structures of organized memory. It did not require oxygen or plasma to burn. It required the focused reverence of conscious minds. When the tide hit the main promenade of the Great Hall, the environment violently warped. The towering iridium statues and the thousands of glowing holographic portraits did not melt. Instead, they became hyperconductive summoning matrices. The entity latched onto the curated data of every hero, using the abstract concepts of glory, sacrifice, and conquest as literal geographic coordinates to pull itself into physical reality. The air turned a sickly, luminescent yellow, filled with a deafening roar of static and overlapping, distorted victory speeches playing backward. The entity did not strike randomly. It hunted by the brightness of the target's reputation. A celebrated Kral shock general, a veteran of 80 different planetary sieges, was the first to react. He roared a battle command, drawing his heavy plasmacaster and ordering his honor guard into a flawless, textbook defensive phalanx. It was the exact maneuver that had earned him his most famous medal. The mnemonic tide devoured him in a fraction of a second. Because his tactical genius was perfectly recorded, widely studied, and deeply revered, the entity already knew the exact geometry of his defense before he even finished speaking the order. The air around the Kral general simply folded inward in a localized geometry of yellow static. His honor guard fired wildly into the twisting air, their blasts passing harmlessly through the conceptual storm. The general vanished, leaving behind only the clatter of his empty armor hitting the polished marble floor. All across the grand concourse, the brightest stars of the academy were being systematically erased. The highest-ranking instructors, the cadets with the most flawless academic scores, the diplomats wearing sashes heavy with honors, they were glowing beacons in a pitch-black ocean, drawing the absolute worst kind of leviathan. Their legendary status, the very thing that defined their existence, had instantaneously mutated into a terminal vulnerability. The surviving alien war veterans, beings who had conquered entire star systems, experienced a sensation they had eradicated from their bloodlines centuries ago total, paralyzing helplessness. They were firing highly advanced kinetic weapons at a weaponized thought. Through the sheer, blinding chaos, a single voice cut through the panic with the precision of a scalpel. "Strip your ranks," Elias Rook did not shout. He did not request permission from the surviving station commanders. He simply stepped into the center of the panicked crowd, leaning heavily on his wooden cane, and assumed absolute dictatorial control. His voice carried a terrifying, absolute authority that bypassed all military protocol. "Tear off your medals," Rook ordered, his eyes tracking the shifting yellow static cascading down the walls. "Deactivate your biometric identification tags. Purge every single cadet leaderboard from the internal network right now. Erase your commendations. If your name is on a plaque in this room, you will be dead in exactly 2 minutes. Become nobody." There was a microsecond of ingrained, aristocratic hesitation from the surrounding officers. Then, a Thalaxian captain ripped the heavy gold epaulets from his shoulders and hurled them across the room. The spell broke. The elite of the galaxy frantically began tearing at their own uniforms, shattering their digital transponders, and aggressively deleting their own glorious histories from their wrist consoles. At the edge of the collapsing hall, Greer Holloway was already moving. She did not wait for further instructions. She grabbed Cadet Julian by the collar and aggressively signaled to Kaylor Drave and Siren Hall. "We are abandoning the primary corridors," Greer stated, her voice tight and completely devoid of panic. She pointed toward a heavy, unmarked steel grate set into the floor near the atmospheric scrubbers. "The grand hallways are lined with commemorative plaques and battle tapestries. Those are the memory arteries. If we walk past them, the tide will read our surface thoughts and pull us apart. We are taking the thermal maintenance shafts." Kaylor froze. He was a Valor prince, bred for the vanguard, conditioned to march exclusively through the center of the grandest archways. The thermal shafts were cramped, filthy, and entirely lacking in dignity. Furthermore, he was being given a direct, non-negotiable command by a human cadet who was biologically younger and technically subordinate to him. His massive ego flared, a hot spike of indignation rising in his throat. He looked at the rusted floor grate, then back at Greer. Greer did not argue. She just stared at him with those flat, dead eyes. She was offering him the exact same cold arithmetic of survival that Elias Rook had demonstrated in the simulation. Kaylor swallowed the bitter, jagged pill of his own pride. He felt a foundational piece of his aristocratic identity crack and fall away. He gave a single, sharp nod, submitting completely to the human's authority. He reached down, gripped the heavy steel grate, and ripped it out of the floor with his bare hands. The squad dropped into the stifling, pitch-black heat of the maintenance tunnels. They moved in absolute silence, navigating by the dim red glow of emergency thermal sensors. The air tasted of rust and burning ozone. Above them, the station groaned as the mnemonic tide systematically hunted through the upper decks, tearing through anyone foolish enough to hold onto their rank. Sira drifted at the rear of the squad, her telepathic aura tightly compressed against her skin. She was bleeding from her left nostril. The psychic pressure radiating from the entity above was agonizing. It was a swirling, chaotic hurricane of stolen memories and weaponized glory. Suddenly, the rusted metal walls of their narrow tunnel began to vibrate with a faint, sickly yellow luminescence. The tide was seeping downward. It had detected the faint, lingering echo of Kaylor's exceptional tactical scores. The Valor prodigy's inherent brilliance was bleeding through his forced humility. "It has our vector," Kaylor whispered, his hand gripping his sidearm, though he knew the weapon was entirely useless. Sira squeezed her eyes shut. She pushed her mind outward, instinctively trying to read the entity's intent, attempting to predict its angle of attack. The moment her consciousness brushed against the tide, a blinding spike of pure agony lanced through her skull. The entity did not have a mind to read. It was a mirror reflecting her own tactical knowledge back at her as a weapon. She recoiled, severing the psychic connection. In that fraction of a second, an epiphany struck her. If the mnemonic tide hunted by reading the organized structure of their thoughts, then the only shield was cognitive collapse. "Do not think of your training," Sira hissed, grabbing Kaylor's arm. "Do not conceptualize a defense. I am going to cut it out of your head." Sira did not project her mind outward. Instead, she turned her telepathic ability entirely inward, enveloping the minds of Greer, Julian, and Kaylor. With a brutal, surgical strike of psychic force, she intentionally induced a localized, temporary amnesia. She forced them to completely forget their own names. She wiped their understanding of military strategy, erasing their knowledge of how to hold a rifle or form a defensive perimeter. For a terrifying span of 10 seconds, the 4 cadets were reduced to absolute, unthinking biological slates. They did not know what they were running from, nor did they know how to fight it. The sickly yellow luminescence seeping through the tunnel walls suddenly paused. The mnemonic tide washed over their location. It probed the dark space, searching for the sharp, distinct edges of a trained warrior's mind. It searched for the concept of defiance, the memory of a battle formation, or the spark of tactical genius. It found nothing but cognitive static. It found 4 minds that were entirely blank, possessing no structural narrative for the entity to latch onto. To the mnemonic tide, they had become completely invisible. The yellow glow faded, retreating back toward the upper decks to hunt for more prominent prey. Sira released her psychic grip, gasping for air as she let their memories rush violently back into their skulls. Kaylor staggered against the hot pipes, clutching his head as his identity reassembled itself, profoundly shaken by the invasive violation of his own mind. "It worked," Sira breathed, wiping the blood from her upper lip. "I cannot fight it, but I can make us forget how to fight. If we do not know we are soldiers, it cannot see us." Greer looked at the Orobi telepath, recognizing the sheer tactical value of the horrific maneuver. They had found their camouflage. They were no longer legends, nor were they even soldiers. They were ghosts moving through the veins of a dying monument, marching directly toward the epicenter of the storm. The blast doors of Helios Bastion did not yield. Every primary hangar bay, every emergency escape pod, and every docking umbilical had been physically bolted shut. The mnemonic tide was not merely wandering the upper corridors like a mindless beast. It had aggressively integrated itself into the station's automated infrastructure. It was actively rewriting the central security protocols using the Academy's own ceremonial data. The exit routes were heavily encrypted with the very victory codes and honorific titles the Academy had spent centuries worshipping. Nobody could leave until the central memory core, buried deep beneath the Hall of Honors, was completely and violently severed. In a dimly lit atmospheric regulation bunker located 2 miles below the main concourse, the surviving command element huddled around a crude, analog schematic table. Elias Rook placed a small, heavily shielded physical drive onto the rusted metal surface. "We cannot shoot our way out of a concept," Rook stated, his voice raspy but unyielding, cutting through the ambient panic of the room. "The tide is anchoring itself to the hierarchy. To starve it, we must execute a lantern cut." A heavy, suffocating silence filled the bunker. "We must manually initiate a total, unrecoverable purge of the Helios Bastion Central Archive," Rook explained, his cold gaze sweeping over the gathered alien veterans. "We wipe the legend rankings. We delete the commendations, the historical battle logs, the statues' structural schematics, and the holographic memorials. We collapse the entire architecture of fame. We give the entity absolutely nothing clear or brilliant to hold on to. We plunge the room into conceptual darkness." The reaction was instantaneous and violently hostile. An Ethelite fleet commander, his luminescent skin flickering with raw, uncontained rage, slammed his armored fist onto the table. "You are asking us to erase our souls," the commander snarled, his voice echoing off the low ceiling. "My bloodline has fought for 1,000 years to earn our place in that archive. Our ancestors live within those records. To delete them is to commit cultural genocide. I would rather die facing that storm with my weapon drawn than erase the legacy that defines my entire existence. It is cowardice." Several other alien veterans murmured in fierce agreement, their hands drifting instinctively toward their sidearms. To them, physical death was a temporary, honorable setback. Being completely forgotten was the ultimate, unforgivable defeat. Standing near the back of the bunker, Greer Holloway suddenly understood the crushing weight of the lesson she had delivered on her very first day at the Academy. The story of Willis Stroud was never just a minor anecdote designed to provoke the warrior castes. It was a perfectly scaled miniature of the entire human survival strategy. Willis Stroud had burned in a sealed room holding a signal so others could pass, and her name had been buried by her own people. She was the lantern. The Earth Doctrine was not about finding someone brave enough to fight the monster. It was about finding someone disciplined enough to destroy their own legacy in order to keep the rest of the species breathing. Kaelor Drave stepped forward, his tall frame cutting through the dim light. "I will draw it off," the Valor Prince declared. His tone was entirely stripped of its former aristocratic arrogance, replaced by a cold, practical resolve that surprised everyone in the room. "My tactical profile is one of the highest in the Academy. If I reactivate my transponder and run for the upper observation decks, the tide will follow my signature. I will give you the time you need to reach the core and enact the purge." Rook shook his head slowly, a grim shadow passing over his weathered face. "No, Cadet Drev. You are offering a noble sacrifice, but you are fundamentally misunderstanding the physics of this enemy. The tide has already tasted your tactical algorithms during the simulation in the crucible. It knows your shape perfectly. If you offer yourself to it, you will not act as a distraction. You will act as a battery. It will consume your brilliance and use it to lock down the remaining sectors twice as fast. Rook picked up the physical drive from the table. He did not hand it to the Ethelite commander, or any of the seasoned alien generals. He walked across the room and held it out to Greer. As she reached out to take the heavy metal cylinder, Greer caught sight of a tiny alphanumeric string etched into its reinforced casing. It was a primary authorization cipher. It contained her own specific cadet serial number, alongside a timestamp dated exactly 10 months ago, long before she had even received her acceptance letter to Helios Bastion. A freezing wave of realization crashed over her. She looked up at the old auditor, her dark eyes narrowing with a sudden, sharp fury. "You knew," Greer whispered, her voice laced with venom. "You did not just happen to be sitting in the back of the auditorium during my presentation. You have been monitoring my psychological evaluations since my orbital training on Earth." "I needed a very specific architecture of mind," Rook admitted, staring back at her without a single shred of apology. "The galaxy is full of brilliant tacticians who require a stage to function. I needed a commander who fundamentally understood how to operate in the absolute dark, without an audience. I needed someone who could hold the lantern and let the heat burn their own hands without crying out. You were not selected for this academy to learn their methods, Cadet Holloway. You were placed here to dismantle them when the time came." Greer felt a sickening surge of betrayal. She had been a piece on a board she did not even know existed, maneuvered into the exact center of a cosmic trap by her own high command. Her autonomy had been an illusion, but the anger was a luxury she could not afford. The station groaned above them, the terrifying sound of tearing metal echoing down through the ventilation shafts. The logic of his manipulation was inescapable. She snatched the drive tightly from Rook's hand. "When this is over," Greer said, her voice dropping to a lethal, perfectly controlled whisper, "we are going to have a very long conversation about my deployment parameters." "If we survive the next 30 minutes, Rook replied evenly, leaning back onto his cane. "You may court-martial me yourself." The path to the central core required them to pass directly through the belly of the beast. They had to cross the threshold of the Hall of Honors to access the manual override terminal, buried beneath the main floor. Greer, Kalor, Sira, and Rook left the relative safety of the bunker, moving rapidly upward through the rusted access stairwells. Sira kept her telepathic dampening field wrapped tightly around the group, holding their minds in a state of forced, agonizing blankness whenever the sickly yellow light bled through the cracks in the heavy bulkheads. The psychic strain was causing dark blood to leak continuously from the telepath's nose and ears, but she refused to let the shield drop. They finally reached the massive, ornate double doors of the Grand Hall. The heavy iridium panels, forged to withstand an orbital bombardment, had been blown entirely outward by the sheer conceptual pressure building inside the room. Beyond the broken threshold, the Hall of Honors was entirely unrecognizable. It was a blazing, chaotic inferno of weaponized ghosts. Towering avatars of ancient conquerors, woven entirely from yellow static and screaming data, clashed and swirled in a maddening hurricane of forgotten wars. The air was so thick with the stolen pride of 100 different civilizations that it was physically difficult to push forward. The noise was a deafening roar of countless victory speeches, overlapping into a wall of pure static. Hidden in the lower levels, the remnants of the Academy's elite watched through isolated, analog security feeds. The greatest tactical minds in the known universe were paralyzed, holding their breath in the dark as they witnessed an impossible sight. An old, battered auditor, an alien telepath bleeding from her eyes, a humbled Valor prince, and a young human cadet holding a metal cylinder stood at the very edge of the blazing abyss. They were staring directly into the heart of galactic pride, preparing to step inside the fire and burn it all to ash. The air inside the grand chamber felt exactly like moving through a localized gravity shear, made entirely of shattered glass and burning ozone. The mnemonic tide had bypassed its preliminary scouting phase and coalesced into a towering tidal wave of sickly, golden light and screaming, corrupted data. It was a massive, shifting architecture composed of millions of perfectly memorized victories, ancient battle cries, and tactical triumphs. It thrashed against the structural containment fields of the room, roaring with the stolen voices of 1,000 different alien species. It was violently demanding a central, glorious name to devour. It needed an apex. It needed a supreme god of war to anchor itself completely into the physical realm. Elias Rook stepped out from the relative safety of the reinforced blast doors and walked directly into the blinding light of the storm. The frail, stooped posture of the civilian auditor vanished entirely. He dropped his wooden cane to the marble floor. He stood perfectly straight, his chest broad, his presence suddenly filling the massive space with a terrifying gravity that easily rivaled the largest alien warlords. "It is searching for a flagship," Rook shouted, his voice cutting through the deafening roar of the conceptual storm like a physical blade. "It wants the Supreme Commander. I will give it exactly what it wants." Rook tapped a heavy, complex kinetic sequence into his wrist console, violently bypassing the civilian administrative locks. His plain gray uniform instantly flickered. The holographic overlay dissolved, rewriting itself into the stark, pitch-black dress uniform of a United Earth Directorate Fleet Admiral. 5 silver stars illuminated sharply on his collar. "I am Admiral Elias Rook," he announced. His voice was instantly amplified by the station's emergency public address system, echoing down into every single bunker, maintenance shaft, and survival shelter across the entire expanse of Helios Bastion. "Supreme Commander of the Nightward Fleet, we are the original architects of the mnemonic war. 40 years ago, we defeated this exact entity, not with plasma batteries, but by completely erasing our own armada from the historical record. We locked the enemy in absolute oblivion by ensuring there was absolutely nothing left for it to remember. The revelation hit the surviving alien generals hiding in the deep subterranean bunkers like a kinetic bombardment. The human military files were not thin because they lacked victories. The Directorate had intentionally martyred the legacy of its greatest generation to build a conceptual cage for an apocalypse. This is the undeniable truth of our silence," Rook roared, staring directly into the golden face of the storm as it surged toward him. "We learned through oceans of our own blood that public glory is the fuel for the end of the world. Every single small legend of Earth, the beacon keepers, the airlock engineers, the field medics, the signal technicians, they are all fragments of one massive, unbroken tradition. We learned how to shatter the pedestal. When the grand monuments become targets, the ordinary nameless soldier must become the ultimate fulcrum of survival." The tide reared back, recognizing the massive, suppressed weight of Rook's true identity. The entity prepared to crash down and consume the greatest hidden legend in the galaxy. "Cadet Holloway, get to the central core," Rook commanded, his eyes locked on the golden wave. "Initiate the purge. We must wipe the Hall of Honors totally clean. Every portrait, every rank, every public medal, and every symbolic hierarchy must be destroyed right now. We have to shatter the most arrogant memories of this galaxy to starve it out." The command demanded the ultimate cultural suicide from the proud alien empires. To delete their history was a fate worse than physical death. But down in the command bunker, before the frantic protests could even begin to formulate, a massive, scarred hand slammed onto a subterranean terminal. General Drox Kareth, the living god of the Thalaxian heavy infantry, entered his supreme command authorization code. "My legacy is nothing but ash if my soldiers are dead," Kareth growled into the open communication channel. With a single, brutal strike of his fist, he manually deleted his own combat record. The greatest, most decorated name in the known universe instantly vanished from the Academy archives. Inspired by their most revered warrior, The other alien commanders desperately rushed to the consoles, frantically wiping their own glorious histories from existence. Up in the blazing hall, Greer sprinted toward the central memory core podium. The Tide sensed the incoming deletion protocol and violently manifested kinetic avatars to stop her. Towering golden warriors made of hard light and weaponized pride stepped from the storm. Kalor Drave intercepted them first. The Valor Prince did not fight with the elegant, boastful strikes of his royal lineage. He fought like a nameless, desperate foot soldier. He used his immense physical strength and flawless martial technique to shatter the golden constructs, willingly absorbing brutal kinetic strikes to his own armor to keep Greer's path clear. Behind him, Sira Null pushed her telepathic abilities far past the point of agonizing pain. She did not shield their minds. She violently attacked the Tide's conceptual models. Every single time the entity tried to form a coherent battle strategy from the stolen memories of the Hall, Sira shattered the pattern. She aggressively scrambled the tactical data, breaking the memory structures so the Tide could not reattach or coordinate its golden soldiers. Greer reached the central podium. The heat radiating from the core was blistering, threatening to melt the skin right off her hands. She slammed the physical drive into the primary port and twisted the heavy locking mechanism. "Lantern cut confirmed," she shouted, smashing her hand down on the execution key. The deletion was instantaneous and catastrophic. The grand holographic projectors overloaded and detonated in a massive shower of white sparks. The towering iridium statues lost their magnetic cohesion and crumbled instantly into fine, gray dust. The digital archives, spanning tens of thousands of years of galactic vanity, were completely, irreversibly wiped clean in a fraction of a second. The Hall of Honors turned violently white. Then, it became entirely blank. The mnemonic Tide shrieked. The sound was a horrifying, high-pitched frequency of pure starvation. It reached out frantically, searching for a hero's peak to climb, searching for a brilliant warlord to consume. It found absolutely nothing. It found only a vast, flat conceptual plane of nameless, unrecorded survival, denied the essential fuel of worship. The golden storm began to rapidly decay. It lost its towering shape, dissolving from a tidal wave into a scattered, glowing mist. Finally, it collapsed into absolute, deafening silence. The entity was not defeated by overwhelming firepower. It was starved to death by a unified, agonizing refusal to be worshipped. The weeks that followed the crisis reshaped the fundamental philosophy of Helios Bastion forever. The grand amphitheaters and lecture halls were meticulously rebuilt, but the walls of the Great Hall remained bare, unpolished white stone. There were no new statues commissioned. There were no holographic tapestries hanging from the ceiling. During the first open assembly after the station was secured, Kalor Drev stood before the entire surviving student body and the alien high command. He looked at the empty white walls, and then he looked directly at the human delegation. "I confuse the deafening noise of fame with actual stature," Kalor stated, his voice echoing with a profound, hard-earned humility. "I believed that a monument was the only accurate measure of our value. I was wrong. True greatness does not require a pedestal to stand upon." 3 months later, the final graduation ceremony commenced. The atmosphere in the auditorium was profoundly different from any previous year. There were no theatrical light shows, no grand military parades, and no boastful speeches promising future galactic conquests. The Academy superintendent simply stood at the wooden podium and began reading the names of the passing cadets. Cadet Greer Holloway, the superintendent, called out into the quiet room. Greer stood up from her seat in the front row. Instantly, every single person in the massive auditorium stood up with her. The Valor Elite, the Kral Shock Troopers, the Ethelite Tacticians, and the Arobi Telepaths all rose in unison in a completely silent, overwhelming display of profound respect. Greer took her seat. The superintendent looked down at the next name on the digital slate. Cadet Julian Hayes. Julian stood up. The entire hall remained standing. They did not sit down. As every subsequent name was called, regardless of the cadet species, their combat rank, or their final academic scores, the entire academy remained on their feet. It was the final, brutal lesson of the Earth Doctrine, now permanently etched into the military culture of the stars. The true, enduring legend of humanity was never about one single person being remembered forever in the archives of history. It was simply about ensuring the very next person in line was still alive to stand up. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please comment below to let me know where you are listening from, so we can interact and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.